Alright, YouTubers, figured I'd make a little video regarding the PlayStation controllers, as I recently came to discover that I actually have a rare piece in my collection. So this will be more kind of like the evolution of the PlayStation controllers, starting with the originals. As far as the PS1 is concerned, this is the original controller that was shipped with it. It's basically what everyone is familiar with. Just, I think Sony called this just a regular digital gamepad or some crap like that. Essentially, it's just like, really, it's a Super Nintendo controller with some hand grips and 2 extra buttons added to it. And those who know their video game history well should know that it's not really a surprise that this is basically what it is, since the PlayStation was actually supposed to be an add-on for the Super Nintendo before Nintendo and Sony parted ways. And if you don't believe me, just look it up. But yeah, this controller is what they all started out with. They added the extra shoulder buttons and the grip handles so that you could hold it a bit easier. But as more and more games started using like first-person views and flight controls and all that fun stuff, they decided that they should really start adding the analog sticks. Now this controller, most people have completely forgotten that it even exists, myself included, until recently. I originally got this at a thrift store, and once I got it home, I kind of had figured that I had just got a regular like DualShock, where it was so worn down that the rubber on the sticks was actually like completely gone for the most part. But it turns out that's not true. This was actually the predecessor to the DualShock. When released in Japan, it actually had a rumble motor inside. This is the North American version, which lacks rumble. Although the funny thing is, if you take one of these things apart and look inside, you actually can add a rumble motor to it. The mount, like and molded into the plastic, it's still there, and the solder points for the motor are still on the circuit board. So if you really wanted to, you could add rumble to this thing. But yeah, there are some pretty big differences from this thing compared to the original. Namely, if this thing could hold still for a minute, the size of the hand grips. Stop moving. Kind of hard to see, but on this one, which they call it just the dual analog controller, whatever, they're actually almost an inch longer compared to the original, which makes for a much more comfortable grip on the actual controller. Another difference here, the actual control sticks, there's no rubber on them. It's just plastic, and they are concave instead of the regular mushroom shape of the DualShock, which is right there. But yeah, the sticks actually feel pretty loose compared to the DualShock, so I haven't personally used this thing to control any games yet, but it would probably take a bit more like movement in order to do like precise movements on the screen and whatnot. But I don't know, I actually prefer this analog stick shape. It's more akin to the Xbox controller shape for the sticks, but that's just personal preference. There's really no right or wrong answer for that one. It's all based on how you like to play your games, I guess. One of the other differences on this controller is the shoulder buttons. You can see right here, if I can hold this thing properly, there's a bit more of a gap between the 1 and 2 buttons on each side, which kind of makes sense. If you're holding the controller like this, it's a lot more comfortable. Plus the fact that the 2 button actually has a ridge, so that you can actually automatically know which button you're hitting based on where your finger is, as opposed to every other DualShock and the original, which has no ridges. And The other feature that this controller has that no other DualShock has is the fact that the analog mode supports the flight stick controller, which, if anyone hasn't heard of this thing, look up pictures of it. It's freaking massive. Like, I swear to God, the controller itself is bigger than the PlayStation. It's basically got like two giant joysticks for like controlling planes and whatnot on the games that are compatible with it, which there aren't many. But I'll show you what the compatibility mode is. For the analog button, if you press it once, you get the red LED, which shows that it's in analog mode. For this controller, if you press it again, it goes into green mode, which means it's in flight stick compatibility mode for those games that support that. Press it again and it turns off. Now if you do that with the regular DualShock controller, you press it once, it goes into analog, press it again, it's off. They took that compatibility feature out, I guess because there was only a handful of games that actually used the flight stick controller or were compatible with it, or you get the point. But in any case, this thing was only out on the market for less than a year. Like, I don't know the specifics, but this thing came out, and then within a year, like maybe 6, 7, 8 months or whatever, the DualShock was released. So this thing had a very short shelf life, so it's very hard to find these things. And if you do happen to find them, get them. Just because of the collectability factor, these things are not easy to come by anymore. So when they ended up going to the DualShocks, they obviously added the mushroom-shaped control sticks that are more stiffer. They have more resistance. They changed the way the analog button is shaped. On this one, you can see that it's kind of recessed into the controller. On this one, it's completely raised. You can see right there. So I guess they changed that in case you're like messing around with the sticks and you happen to hit the button by accident, it would kind of mess up the controls. But I don't know, I've never actually done anything like drastic enough to be hitting that button by accident, so it's never been a concern for me. And on the DualShocks, they got rid of the ridge on the 2 button, which to me makes no sense. Like, people could have used that. And the 2 button is actually bigger so that there's less of a gap between the 1 and 2. Again, another one of those weird decisions, but whatever. And they went back to the shorter grip handles. Now, judging from the videos that I've watched, those who have this controller really like the fact that it has the longer grip handles because it just feels that much more comfortable. But can't really do anything now because every other DualShock controller has the shorter grip handles. As you can see here, this one is the DualShock released when the PS1, the small little white one, was released. It looks exactly the same as this DualShock, except for the fact that it's basically white. And the PS2 DualShock 2 is pretty much the exact same thing. The only difference really with the DualShock 2 is that in analog mode, the face buttons are also analog. They're not digital, so they're actually pressure sensitive. So if you really press hard, that actually makes a difference in the games that it's compatible with. And I think the D-pad is the same thing, but I'm not sure about that. And obviously DualShock 3, well, they actually went to the 6-axis before that. Sony kind of buggered up with a lawsuit and whatnot, so they didn't put rumble in these things originally. So they were originally just 6-axis, but then they decided to bring out the DualShock 3, which has rumble and is basically the exact same stuff as usual, except that the trigger buttons are now actual triggers, not just buttons. But the controller itself stays pretty much the exact same. They added the home button where the analog button used to be. But yeah, so that's a fun little evolution of the PlayStation controllers. this little guy is definitely something worth picking up if you can find one, just for the sake of having one, because there aren't too many out there, at least that I know of, and not too many people know that these even existed. But yeah, that's the true evolution of the Sony PlayStation controllers, going from the original to the dual analog, dual shock, the revised dual shock, to the dual shock 2, and then dual shock 3. And whenever they decide to create a PlayStation 4, I guess it'll be the exact same thing again, but updated. Yada, yada, yada. So, there we go.